Let's break down each and every defense that will help you dominate week 13 of the 2024 fantasy football season and go over each and every defense that you can possibly pick up off of the waiver wire to help you dominate week 13 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 13 NFL pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code catch a free NFL pick'em to use towards Week 13's action. And on top of that, as long as you sign up on Underdog with promo code DCatch, that link is down below, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. All right, let's start the video off with the Houston Texans, who will be facing the Jacksonville Jaguars and Mac Jones here in week 13. So the Texans coming off another dominant defensive performance. They've had 10 or more fantasy points in every game since week 8, except for week 9. But in their last two games, 18 or more fantasy points. In week 12, they came away with 8 total sacks, a forced fumble, a pick, and a defensive touchdown. Absolutely dominant from a fantasy perspective. I know they ended up losing, and Will Levis still did some good things in that game, but all we care about in this video is the fantasy points, 18 fantasy points, and I don't see any reason why that would stop against Mac Jones and company. We look at Mac Jones since he's become the starter for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He has 3 interceptions and a lost fumble. He has not thrown for more than 138 passing yards in a game, and he has 0 passing touchdowns on the season. The Texans on the season have 34 sacks, 8 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, 14 interceptions, and 1 scoring touchdown. And that actually, those numbers, exclude this past week. So ultimately, they have been very good on the season. This is probably my favorite overall play on the week. I know they sit at 85% rostered, so you're not going to be able to go out, pick them up off of the waiver wire. But if they're out there, you're definitely picking them up. And if you own them, you have to start them. They are my must-start defense headed in to week 13. Next up, let's talk about the Denver Broncos, who will face Jameis Winston and the Cleveland Browns in week 13 at home. They sit at 79% rostered, but I still think they're in that must-start category. I know you won't be able to pick them up, but looked very good in week 11. They carry that over in week 12 against the Raiders with 10 fantasy points. I know kind of in the second half of that game, towards the end of the game, looked like they're going to walk away with single digits, and they got the forced fumble on Desmond Ridder, all that stuff. But ultimately, they came away with 10 fantasy points. That's all we care about. 5 sacks, a forced fumble, fumble recovery, and an interception. They've been fantastic on the season. Now they're going to play Jameis Winston, which I know, listen, I like Jameis Winston as much as the next guy, but he still had a fumble and lost fumble, and an interception in week 12. 3 interceptions in week 9 and a fumble in that game, a lost fumble in week 8, and should have had at least 1 interception in week 8. I know he had a very clean game against New Orleans, and like I said, I like Jameis Winston as much as the next guy. And last week, kind of hard to judge because it was a snow game and everything, but I think we have to admit, at home, there's plenty of turnover potential for the Denver Broncos going up against Jameis Winston here in week 13. So if you own the Broncos, roll with them. They got a very safe floor this week. For some reason, they're out there on the waiver wire. Pick them up, roll with them as well. They're a strong start, a must-start defense in week 13. Except let's talk about the Kansas City Chiefs, who will get the Las Vegas Raiders on a Black Friday game the day after Thanksgiving this year. They sit at 89% rostered, so once again, not a team that you're going to be able to pick up off of the waiver wire. And I was one of the few people who wasn't really super into playing the Kansas City Chiefs in week 12. They did not make the must-start list last week against the Panthers, and I did make the argument that the Panthers may be a little bit better than you think, but my main argument was the Chiefs are just not a good fantasy defense. Great real-life defense. They're not a good fantasy defense. They have double digits once on the season. They've been bottom 12 in fantasy scoring amongst defensive units, essentially the entire season. I mean, they just are not a good fantasy defense. They don't get a ton of turnovers. And that's what we're looking for mainly when it comes to fantasy scoring, right? So we look on the season, they have 4 forced fumbles, 6 picks. They have 7 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, 6 picks, 1 scoring touchdown. That's it. We look on the season as well. They only have 21 total sacks. So, I mean, nothing awful there, but we're certainly missing that upside that you would get from a team that turns the football over a lot. So, with all that being said, moving along to this week, we know that they're going to play the Raiders, and we got a messy quarterback situation when it comes to the Las Vegas Raiders. Gardner Minshew ruled out for the remainder of the season with a collarbone injury. So that's going to leave Desmond Ridder most likely as the starting quarterback this week. We may see Aiden O'Connell come off of IR. Either way, I don't really care, right? I mean, we have a strong defense that will have a very safe floor going up against either Aiden O'Connell or Desmond Ridder. That makes them a strong start. Maybe the Raiders, like if O'Connell can't come off of IR, they go out and sign somebody. I mean, that would probably be an even better situation from a fantasy perspective. So I do think the turnover potential is there this week, regardless of who the Raiders quarterback is. And that is the main reason that they are going to be a must-start defense for the first time in quite a while on the channel here in Week 13. All right, next up, let's talk about the Dallas Cowboys. How about them Cowboys making a little resurgence here at the end of the season? 24 fantasy points against my Washington Commanders in Week 12. Fantastic day, 4 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, a fumble recovery, 2 interceptions. I mean, they still gave up 26 points and 412 total yards, but 24 total fantasy points, that's all we care about. Now, against like 99% of teams, I probably wouldn't consider them like a nice streaming option this week, but they're going up against the Giants and my guy Tommy DeVito, who I actually had some faith in against the Bucs this past week. But Tommy DeVito, next to nothing in that matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 21 of 31, 189 passing yards, 32 yards on the ground. No passing or rushing touchdowns. So now we get a Thanksgiving matchup between Cooper Rush, Tommy DeVito, and I'm going to give the edge to the Dallas Cowboys. We look at this past week, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had 12 fantasy points, which was one of our calls in last week's video, against Tommy DeVito and company. We also talked about the Commanders' defense, as most people did, as they were going up against Cooper Rush, but they walked away with just 5 fantasy points. So I'm going to give the edge in this Thanksgiving battle between 2 stud quarterbacks to the Dallas Cowboys in terms of what defense we want to stream in that matchup, because we know both defenses have an opportunity in this game, but Cooper Rush has been okay over the past 2 weeks. So I say let's roll with the Cowboys defense coming off of a strong performance. Now, of course, there's risk here, but we want to include some teams that have some nice upside that are sitting at a low roster percentage. Cowboys sitting at 20% on Thanksgiving Day might just come through with a Thanksgiving miracle for your fantasy lineup. All right, and you know we're not doing a must-start video without talking about the Minnesota Vikings coming off of their 3rd single-digit performance on the season with just 7 fantasy points against the Chicago Bears, a game that saw a lot of offense overall. We did see a forced fumble out of the Vikings and 3 sacks, but outside of that, nothing that we're looking for. 398 total yards allowed, 27 points allowed, in a thin victory for the Vikings, but they are still a must-start defense for me. We look back to this past week. Look at Kyler Murray. He's been very up and down. The ceilings are very high. The floors are pretty low. 11.3 fantasy points against Seattle, 24 37, 285 passing yards, a pick. So he has a fumble or an interception in each of the last 4 games. And last week, the Cardinals just looked a little stiff offensively, couldn't really get it going, including Kyler Murray. So I think the potential is there for Minnesota. And I talked about this past week. Like, I don't know if the Vikings have an extreme amount of upside, but I think they have a very safe floor, and they are arguably one of the best overall defensive units in the entire NFL. And for that reason, they give you a safe floor on a weekly basis from a fantasy perspective. And this week against Kyler Murray and company, well, there is risk because the Cardinals can have one of these weeks where they really show up again. I still think that they come through with a very safe floor. So another defense, very highly rostered at 92% rostered. But if you own them, I would have confidence in them this week. I think they're still a must-start defense in Week 13. All right, and I want to wrap up the must-start defenses. We're going to talk about a couple other teams, but in terms of must-start defenses, I want to wrap up with the Buffalo Bills. But I do want to kind of talk about this one having a little bit of contingency because we really want to look at what's going on with Brock Purdy and the San Francisco 49ers quarterback situation. So we know that Purdy missed this past week dealing with that shoulder injury, and he has the chance to return in Week 13. And the way the Niners season is going, they might really push for him to play. I don't know if he's going to be fully healthy, but if he ends up not being able to play, I mean, we got to stream the Bills against the Niners, and the Bills have dropped to 42% rostered. So because they're on bye week in Week 12, so you have a chance to actually go out and stream them if they're going to face Brandon Allen, who had an interception, 2 fumbles, and 1 lost fumble, and only threw for 199 passing yards against Green Bay and 1 total touchdown. In Green Bay, I mean, they walked away with a massive fantasy performance against the Niners, 17 total fantasy points. The Bills have averaged 9.2 fantasy points per game on the season and are a top 10 defensive scoring unit when it comes to fantasy football. So this is one of those situations we got to wait and see what the week brings us. But even if the Bills end up playing Brock Purdy, they might still be a solid start because I don't think that Purdy's really going to be fully healthy, as it's his throwing shoulder that is injured. So if Purdy's out, they become an absolute must-start defense. Like, I think if we knew for sure that Purdy wasn't going to play this week, like, they have to be in the must-start category. So I put them in there, but we, of course, have to see what happens as the week progresses. But if they end up getting Allen at quarterback, it's going to be a big week for this Buffalo Bills defense. And let's wrap the video up by going over the rest of the teams here that I think could have solid weeks and kind of my honorable mention, so to speak. The Lions will play on Thanksgiving Day. I think they could end up having a very nice floor, 8 fantasy points, maybe a higher ceiling if they really shut down Caleb Williams. They sit at 80% rostered. They've had 8 or more fantasy points in every game since week 8, 6 or more fantasy points in every game since week 2. So, I mean, they come through with a safe floor. They do sit at 80% rostered, but the Bears have looked a lot better since they made a change at offensive coordinator and very good over the last 2 weeks compared to what we saw on the rest of the season. So there's a little bit of risk here. Thanksgiving Day game. We'll see what happens, but if you have to roll with them, I think they give you a safe floor. Then up next, we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who originally I liked going into this week, but I've also talked over the past like two-ish weeks that the Panthers aren't really just this team that just flat out suck that we can, do whatever we want, start everyone against them, start every defense against them. It hasn't really been that case. So I do like the Bucs. They're coming off of a strong performance against the Giants, but Bryce Young is just not really like this turnover machine, this like low offensive play quarterback that we were seeing at the beginning of the season. I know he still has had some interceptions in the last 4 weeks and 1 fumble, but ultimately, at least in the past 2 weeks, he's been pretty solid, pretty clean outside of the 1 fumble against Kansas City. So I think Tampa Bay could come through with a solid floor, but I think some of that perceived upside we were hoping for might not be there, unfortunately, against the Panthers this week. The next up, we do have the Packers, who we mentioned earlier. Huge day for them against the Niners. Without Jair Alexander, they still had 17 fantasy points, only allowed 10 points. Against a backup quarterback for the Niners, 2 sacks, 4 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, and a pick. Miami looked really good this past week, and they've looked solid over the past couple weeks. So I don't love them that much for that reason. But if you become desperate, I think the Packers could still be a good floor play. Then we got the Patriots coming off of a solid performance against Miami, even giving up 373 total yards and 4 passing touchdowns to Tua. They had 2 sacks, a forced fumble, and a fumble recovery, as well as a defensive scoring touchdown, which left them with 10 fantasy points, even though they gave up 34 total points. They get the Colts, that Colts offense, Anthony Richardson, extremely stagnant this past week. No turnovers, but this could end up being a safe floor play, and they only sit at 5% rostered, so if you're desperate, they could be an option. Now, I think these Seattle Seahawks are very interesting going into the week. They almost made the must-start category because, well, Aaron Rodgers might hit IR because he wants to sit out the rest of the season and all of that. You guys can look at the Aaron Rodgers drama yourself, which would lead Tyrod Taylor as the starting quarterback. I don't know if that's better or worse for the Jets, but this feels like one of those games on the road. Seattle could just put the nail in the coffin on any hope that Jets fans have this season. Which I don't think they have any left. But if there's anything left for Jets fans, I think this could be the week where it officially comes to a close. This is still a defensive-minded overall team in the Seattle Seahawks, and they just had 20 fantasy points against the Arizona Cardinals. Big day for them, 5 total sacks, an interception, a defensive touchdown. They only allowed 6 total points, so they sit at 14% rostered. We'll see what kind of happens with the Aaron Rodgers situation, but even if Rodgers plays, I think they have a good floor. They might move into one of these kind of high upside plays moving into week 13, depending on that quarterback situation. Then to wrap up, I know the Commanders were very disappointing, just 5 fantasy points this past week. They haven't really been an option from a fantasy perspective. We have 14 points in week 5 against Deshaun Watson, 17 in week 7 against Andy Dalton. But outside of that, just single digits in every other game on the season. But Will Levis, although he has looked better, and I do actually kind of like Will Levis, believe it or not, from a streaming capacity in certain circumstances. Yeah, he's improving, right? He's still turning the football over because that's what Will Levis does, and he does allow for good fantasy days for opposing defenses. He had an interception, a lost fumble this past week, an interception in week 11, a fumble in week 10, so he has a turnover in every single game he has played on the season so far. So easily one of the best quarterbacks to stream against. And we talked about Houston at the very beginning of the video. They obviously, even in a loss in a game where they allowed 30 total points, still had 18 fantasy points. So the Commanders have shot up to 71% rostered because they played Cooper Rush and the Cowboys this past week. But because they were so disappointing, expect that number to go down. And if you become desperate, hey, at least they're playing Will Levis here in week 13. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single must-start defense and stream moving into week 13 of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into the week, be sure to drop me a comment. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. But more importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel because we're going to have everything that you could need on a week in, week out basis to help you guys dominate each and every week of fantasy football and everything that you guys could possibly need to dominate week 13 as well. So make sure that you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.